In the shadow of the great empires of the early 20th century stands a figure whose name is rarely mentioned in history textbooks: Alexei Nikolaevich Kuropatkin. A brilliant military theorist, a respected minister, a trusted confidant of the emperor, and a commander-in-chief whose decisions led the Russian army to one of the most humiliating defeats in its history. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 became not just a military conflict, but a point of no return for an entire empire. An Asian power, which Petersburg considered secondary, dealt Russia a blow from which the monarchy never recovered. At the heart of this drama is the paradoxical personality of a general who had prepared for war his entire life, but when it began, found himself psychologically unprepared for its reality. A man whose theoretical works were studied in military academies, in practice demonstrated fatal indecisiveness. The strategy he chose, constant retreat, became a symbol of his command. How did it happen that one of the most educated military leaders of his time went down in history as the architect of defeat? Alexei Nikolaevich Kuropatkin's military career began in 1866, when the 19-year-old graduate of the Pavlovsk Military School received the rank of second lieutenant and was sent to Turkestan. It was here, in the boundless Central Asian steppes, that the young officer first distinguished himself as a capable tactician and brave warrior. Participation in the Samarkand campaign earned him his first combat award, the Order of St. Vladimir with swords and a bow. However, Kuropatkin's true career ascent began after his studies at the Nikolaev Academy of the General Staff, which he graduated from in 1874 with a small silver medal. Academic education opened new horizons and opportunities for him to apply his talents not only on the battlefield, but also in military theoretical work. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, Kuropatkin proved himself to be a skillful chief of staff of General Skobelev's detachment. His composure and analytical mind in planning operations earned him the respect of his colleagues and the attention of the high command. Kuropatkin's talent was particularly evident in the Akal-Teke expedition of 1880 to 1881, where he commanded the vanguard and played a key role in the storming of the Göktepe fortress. For this campaign, he received the rank of Major General and Golden Arms with the inscription, "For Bravery." In subsequent years, Kuropatkin dedicated himself to administrative and scientific work. Appointed head of the Trans-Caspian region, he proved himself to be a talented administrator, contributing to the development of infrastructure and the establishment of relations with the local population. Concurrently, he wrote a number of military theoretical works that earned him a reputation as one of Russia's leading military thinkers. The pinnacle of Kuropatkin's career was his appointment as Minister of War in 1898. In this position, he carried out a number of important reforms aimed at modernizing the army. It was during this period that he earned the special trust of Emperor Nicholas II, who valued his analytical mind and deep knowledge of military affairs. However, fate had a trial in store for Kuropatkin, for which, as history would show, he proved unprepared. His appointment as Commander-in-Chief of all ground and naval forces in the Far East at the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War became a turning point in his career. Kuropatkin's paradox consisted in the fact that during his years of service, he proved himself not only as a brave officer and a skilled administrator, but also as an outstanding military theoretician. His pen produced fundamental works that were studied in military academies across Europe and shaped an entire generation of officers in the Russian army. A special place in Kuropatkin's scientific legacy is occupied by the 4-volume work Tasks of the Russian Army, written in 1898. In this work, he predicted with astonishing accuracy the main geopolitical challenges that Russia would face in the 20th century, including the inevitability of conflict with Japan in the Far East. No less significant was his study, Algeria, based on his personal experience of serving in the French colonial troops. This work revealed the peculiarities of conducting military operations in conditions of a cultural and technological gap between opponents, a topic that would later prove prophetically relevant for Kuropatkin himself in the war with Japan. Kuropatkin's detailed analysis of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 was considered exemplary in the military analytical literature of that time. In it, he accurately identified the causes of the French army's defeat, emphasizing the role of strategic planning, mobilization readiness, and centralized troop command. Ironically, many of the mistakes that Kuropatkin criticized in his theoretical works, he himself repeated while commanding the Russian army in Manchuria. His warnings about the need for thorough preparation for war, about the danger of underestimating the enemy, about the importance of unified command and decisive actions. All these remained on the pages of books when it came time to apply these principles in practice. Especially indicative is his work, Military Strategic Sketch of a Probable War with Japan, where he warned against conflict in the Far East until the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the strengthening of Port Arthur. This work, presented to the emperor several years before the war, contained an accurate forecast of events and recommendations that were ignored by the empire's political leadership. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire found itself in a complex geopolitical situation in the Far East. Russia's expansionist policy in Manchuria and Korea, dictated by the desire for ice-free ports and economic influence in the region, inevitably led to a clash of interests with other powers, primarily with rapidly modernizing Japan. The capture of Port Arthur in 1898 and the subsequent construction of the Chinese Eastern Railway through Manchuria significantly strengthened Russia's presence in the region. However, these actions were perceived in Tokyo as a direct threat to Japanese interests in Korea and northern China. The land of the rising sun, victorious in the war with Qing China and having undergone rapid military modernization, was ready to challenge its northern neighbor. Ironically, it was Kuropatkin, as Minister of War, who repeatedly warned against confrontation with Japan. In his reports to the emperor and at meetings of the Special Committee on Far Eastern Affairs, he insisted on caution and a waiting strategy. "We need to buy time," he wrote in one memorandum of 1903. "The completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the strengthening of Port Arthur will require at least 5 years before we can consider ourselves ready for a serious conflict in the region." However, his voice of reason was drowned out by the chorus of more aggressive advisors to the emperor. State Secretary Alexander Bezobrazov and his so-called Bezobrazov clique, who saw Manchuria and Korea as a source of rapid enrichment through concessions for mineral extraction and logging, played a particularly active role in promoting a confrontational policy. Nicholas II's own position remained inconsistent. On the one hand, he valued Kuropatkin's analytical abilities and heeded his warnings. On the other hand, he succumbed to the influence of the court camarilla, who painted rosy prospects of a small victorious war with an Asian adversary, whom Petersburg continued to underestimate, despite his victory over China. In this atmosphere of political intrigue and strategic short-sightedness, Kuropatkin found himself in an ambiguous position. While publicly supporting the official course, he continued to work on strengthening the defense capabilities of the Far Eastern borders, understanding the inevitability of conflict. When war broke out in January 1904, beginning with a sudden Japanese attack on the Russian squadron in Port Arthur, it was Kuropatkin who was destined to lead an unprepared army in a conflict he had so desperately tried to avoid. On February 8, 1904, Japanese torpedo boats, without declaration of war, attacked the Russian squadron in Port Arthur. The war began, which Kuropatkin had foreseen but hoped to postpone. Upon receiving news of the attack, he immediately petitioned the emperor for his appointment as commander of the Manchurian army. On February 22nd, he was officially appointed to this position, and on March 7th, he arrived in Liaoyang, where the headquarters of the Russian forces in Manchuria was located. Kuropatkin's very first steps as commander exposed a fundamental contradiction between his theoretical views and practical actions. After assessing the situation, he concluded that the Russian army was not ready for decisive action. He reported to St. Petersburg, "This assessment was both accurate and deeply flawed." Kuropatkin correctly identified the enemy's numerical superiority at the initial stage of the war, but catastrophically underestimated the morale, training, and tactical skill of the Japanese army. In his first order to the troops, he wrote, "The enemy is audacious, but not terrible. We must be patient and wait for reinforcements." It was this formula, "be patient," that became the leitmotif of his entire strategy. Instead of active measures to prevent the landing of Japanese troops on the mainland, Kuropatkin chose a waiting tactic. He decided to concentrate the main forces in the Liaoyang area, abandoning attempts to relieve the besieged Port Arthur or prevent the advance of Japanese armies deep into Manchuria. Such a decision had its logic. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the only supply line for the Russian army, could only handle a limited number of trains per day. Kuropatkin expected that over time, numerical superiority would shift to the Russian army. However, this strategy had a fatal flaw. It ceded the strategic initiative to the enemy. The Japanese were quick to take advantage of this. Already in April 1904, the first Japanese army under the command of General Kuropatkin crossed the Yalu River and invaded Manchuria. Kuropatkin, having the opportunity to concentrate significant forces for a counterattack, limited himself to sending a small detachment under General Zasulich, which was defeated in the Battle of Tyurenchen. The Yalu River, flowing along the border of Korea and Manchuria, became the site of the first major clash of the Russo-Japanese War. On April 30, 1904, Japanese troops under the command of General Kuropatkin attacked the positions of General Zasulich's eastern detachment, which numbered approximately 18,000 men against 40,000 Japanese. Despite the enemy's numerical superiority, Zasulich had received orders from Kuropatkin only to conduct a reconnaissance in force and retreat without engaging in a decisive battle. However, the Russian general's ambition and desire to distinguish himself led to the detachment engaging in battle under unfavorable conditions. The Japanese demonstrated superior tactics. Their artillery, positioned on the commanding heights of the Korean bank, methodically suppressed the Russian batteries. The infantry acted decisively, employing flanking maneuvers. By evening, the Russian troops were forced to retreat, losing approximately 2,000 men and 22 guns. Kuropatkin's reaction to this defeat proved indicative of his entire subsequent strategy. Instead of punishing Zasulich for disobeying orders, he saw in the incident confirmation of his initial caution. In a telegram to the emperor, he wrote, "Precisely what I feared has happened. Premature engagement with superior enemy forces led to avoidable losses." This battle became a turning point in the formation of Kuropatkin's strategic thinking. He was now convinced that the only correct path was to avoid decisive engagements until sufficient forces were amassed. His doctrine, which contemporaries would later call the strategy of retreat, received its first practical embodiment. After Yalu, Kuropatkin ordered all advanced detachments to retreat at the slightest threat of encountering large enemy forces. "We need to gain time, not territory," he declared at a staff meeting in Liaoyang. This phrase became the unofficial motto of the campaign. In the following weeks, the Russian army methodically retreated, abandoning one line after another. The Japanese advanced in pursuit, cautiously but steadily. Kuropatkin regularly reported to Petersburg, "Every day our forces increase due to the arrival of reinforcements by rail. Soon the balance of power will shift in our favor." Behind General Kuropatkin's outward confidence lay a man torn by internal contradictions. The brilliant mind of a theoretician was paralyzed by the burden of colossal responsibility. The psychological portrait of the commander-in-chief at this critical moment in history is a complex mosaic of contradictions, fears, and unfulfilled ambitions. In Kuropatkin's personal letters and diaries, which he kept throughout the campaign, emerges the image of a man aware of the magnitude of the mission entrusted to him. "On my shoulders lies the fate not only of the army, but also the prestige of the entire empire," he wrote in his diary after the defeat on the Yalu. This sense of responsibility, instead of mobilizing his best qualities, engendered a paralyzing fear of failure. The man who, in his youth, showed extraordinary bravery in battles in Central Asia now feared not bullets and shells, but the possibility of making a wrong decision. Contemporaries noted a striking change in the general's behavior. If, before the war, Kuropatkin was renowned for the firmness of his judgments and confidence in his rectitude, then in the theater of war he transformed into a man constantly wavering and seeking confirmation for his decisions from subordinates. General Vladimir Sukhomlinov wrote in his memoirs, "Constant pressure from St. Petersburg only exacerbated this indecision. Telegrams from the Emperor and the Ministry of War, demanding decisive actions and a swift transition to offense, forced Kuropatkin to vacillate between his strategic vision and the need to please his superiors. The general particularly struggled with criticism of his retreat strategy. Quote, "Two," he noted bitterly in a letter to his wife, Kuropatkin's paradox was that his theoretical knowledge became an obstacle to making decisions in a real combat situation. He knew too well everything that could go wrong, all possible complications and risks. This excessive information paralyzed his will, turning every decision into an agonizing process of weighing endless pros and cons. By the end of August 1904, the Russian army under the command of Kuropatkin concentrated about 160,000 men in the area of Liaoyang. The Japanese, operating with 3 separate armies under the overall command of Marshal Oyama, had approximately 120,000. For the first time in the entire campaign, the numerical advantage was on the side of the Russian troops. Liaoyang was a powerful fortified area with several lines of defense, built according to the latest in military engineering. The terrain favored the defenders. Hilly relief, the Taizihe River, and numerous hills created natural obstacles for the attackers. It seemed that nature itself and military science gave Kuropatkin an ideal opportunity for a turning point in the war. On August 25th, the Japanese began their offensive. The first attacks were repulsed with heavy losses for the enemy. Russian artillery operated superbly, and the infantry steadfastly held their positions. Reports of successful repulse of attacks in all directions were received at Kuropatkin's headquarters. General Bilderling wrote in his diary. However, Kuropatkin remained true to his cautious strategy. Instead of using the favorable moment for a counterstrike, he continued to accumulate reserves, expecting the Japanese to exhaust themselves in fruitless attacks. The critical moment of the battle came on August 28th, when General Kuropatkin's army executed an outflanking maneuver and crossed the Taizihe River east of Liaoyang. This threat of outflanking the left flank of the Russian position caused panic in Kuropatkin's headquarters. "We are threatened with encirclement," he telegraphed to Petersburg. "I am forced to decide to retreat to save the army." The decision to retreat was made at a time when the Japanese forces were at their limit. Later, Marshal Oyama admitted that another day or two of unsuccessful attacks, and he would have been forced to withdraw his exhausted troops. The Russian army began its withdrawal on the night of August 30th. The retreat was organized, but its moral effect was devastating. Soldiers, who had just successfully repelled enemy attacks, did not understand why they had to abandon advantageous positions. "We could have won, but we were not allowed to," Colonel Apuktin, commander of one of the infantry regiments, bitterly wrote in his memoirs. After a series of defeats and retreats, Kuropatkin needed to justify his strategy, not only to his troops, but also to St. Petersburg. In numerous reports to the Emperor and the Ministry of War, he methodically built a theoretical foundation for his decisions, turning necessity into virtue, and retreat into a special form of military art. Kuropatkin's official explanations were a curious blend of military theory, practical considerations, and psychological defense. In a memorandum dated September 5, 1904, he wrote, "This formula became central to his justification of continuous retreats. In internal military correspondence, Kuropatkin developed this idea even further. He wrote to Adjutant General Sakharov, "His reasoning about the factor of time is particularly interesting." In a memo from October 1904, Kuropatkin asserted, "Paradoxically, these arguments were theoretically impeccable. The Trans-Siberian Railway indeed delivered more and more troops and equipment every day. Russia's resources significantly surpassed those of Japan. However, Kuropatkin overlooked the psychological factor, the morale of the army, undermined by constant retreats." In a letter to Minister of War Sakharov, he admitted, "Our soldiers fight valiantly, but they do not understand why we abandon positions that we successfully hold." To compensate for this demoralizing effect, Kuropatkin constantly promised a transition to decisive actions, but always in an indefinite future. "The moment will soon come when we can deliver a crushing blow." This phrase, in various variations, was repeated in his army orders throughout the campaign. This moment was constantly postponed. Each time when numerical superiority was on the side of the Russian army, Kuropatkin found new reasons for continuing the retreat: unfavorable terrain, unprepared reserves, or the threat of flanking maneuvers. In his memoirs, General Dragomirov sarcastically remarked, "Kuropatkin turned retreat into an art, but forgot that the goal of war is victory, not the preservation of the army in perfect form for a parade after peace is concluded." The Battle of Shaho River, which began on October 5, 1904, became a new trial for Kuropatkin and his strategy. After retreating from Liaoyang, the commander-in-chief received an categorical order from Petersburg to go on the offensive and relieve the besieged Port Arthur. For the first time in the entire campaign, Kuropatkin decided on active operations, but his offensive impulse was half-hearted and indecisive. The operational plan, developed at the headquarters of the Manchurian army, envisioned a frontal assault on Japanese positions along the Shaho River. Kuropatkin had 200,000 soldiers against Marshal Oyama's 170,000. The numerical advantage offered hope for success, but the commander-in-chief's internal doubts affected the preparation of the operation. "I am only advancing because Petersburg demands it, but my heart is not in this undertaking," Kuropatkin confessed to his chief of staff, General Sakharov, on the eve of the battle. This phrase best characterized the commander's psychological state. The offensive began sluggishly and disorganizedly. Instead of concentrating efforts on key sectors, the Russian army stretched out over a wide front, dispersing its forces. The lack of clear coordination between the corps led to uneven progress. Some units moved forward, others lagged behind, creating dangerous gaps in the front line. The Japanese, initially caught off guard by the Russian offensive, quickly recovered and switched to active defense. Marshal Oyama skillfully maneuvered reserves, closing off dangerous areas and preparing counterattacks on the stretched flanks of the Russian army. The culmination of the battle came on October 10th, when the Japanese launched a powerful counterattack on the right flank of the Russian troops. General Stackelberg, who commanded this sector, requested reinforcements, but Kuropatkin, fearing for the center, delayed his decision. When reinforcements were finally dispatched, they arrived too late. The Japanese had broken through the front and created a threat of encirclement for a significant part of the Russian army. In this critical situation, Kuropatkin once again demonstrated his main flaw: indecisiveness at a crucial moment. Instead of committing all reserves to eliminate the breakthrough or resolutely continuing the offensive in other sectors, he ordered a general retreat to the Shaho River, February of 1905. Mukden, the last major city in Manchuria under the control of the Russian army. Here, amidst the snow-covered plains and hills, the final tragedy of Kuropatkin's strategy of retreat unfolded. After months of maneuvering and accumulating forces, the Russian army numbered around 300,000 men against 270,000 Japanese. For the first time in the entire war, the numerical superiority was significant and could have been a decisive factor. Kuropatkin deployed his troops in a semicircle south of Mukden, stretching the front for 80 kilometers. This arrangement contradicted his own theoretical works, where he emphasized the danger of excessively stretching the front line. Quote zero, warned Chief of Staff General Sakharov, but Kuropatkin brushed aside these concerns. On February 19th, the Japanese began their offensive. Marshal Oyama employed a brilliant strategy. Simulating the main blow on the eastern flank, he secretly transferred significant forces to the west. Kuropatkin fell into this trap, concentrating his reserves in the east. When on February 23rd, the true direction of the main blow was discovered, it was already too late. General Nogi's Japanese army broke through the western flank and began an outflanking movement, threatening to encircle the entire Russian army. Kuropatkin's reaction was telling. Instead of a decisive counterattack, he began to transfer troops from one flank to another, creating chaos in command. Orders were replaced by counter-orders. Units rushed between sectors of the front, losing time and morale, recalled General Kolbars. By February 27th, the situation became critical. The Japanese had almost closed the encirclement ring. Panic reigned at headquarters. Kuropatkin, previously so methodical and calm, wavered between decisions. At one moment ordering a counterattack, then canceling the order, then demanding that positions be held at all costs, then permitting retreat. On the evening of the same day, he made a fateful decision: a general retreat to Tiling. But unlike previous retreats, which were carefully planned and organized, this retreat turned into a disorderly flight. Narrow roads, clogged with supply trains and artillery, became a trap for the retreating troops. Japanese artillery methodically shelled the columns, infantry attacked the flanks. Russian units fragmented, lost contact with command, individual units found themselves encircled and perished or surrendered. The losses were catastrophic. About 90,000 men killed, wounded, and captured, 200 guns, thousands of wagons with ammunition and equipment. But even more terrible were the moral losses. Faith in the command was utterly undermined. The Mukden catastrophe became a point of no return not only for Kuropatkin, but for the entire empire. The strategy of retreat, which he so methodically justified and applied, ultimately led to what he feared most: the defeat of the army and national humiliation. On May 27, 1905, an event occurred that became the logical culmination of a series of strategic failures on land: the Battle of Tsushima. The Russian squadron of Admiral Rozhestvensky, which had made an unprecedented voyage from the Baltic to the Far East, was completely destroyed by the Japanese fleet of Admiral Togo. Of the 38 Russian ships, 20 were sunk, 7 captured, and 6 interned in neutral ports. Only 5 managed to break through to Vladivostok. The Russian fleet lost over 5,000 sailors killed and captured. This naval catastrophe was a direct consequence of Kuropatkin's land failures. If his army had been able to relieve Port Arthur, or at least hold Mukden, Rozhestvensky's squadron would have had somewhere to go. But under conditions where all major ports of Manchuria were in Japanese hands, Russian ships were doomed to destruction in an unequal battle. News of the Tsushima defeat was the last straw that broke the camel's back of public patience. Riots erupted throughout Russia, escalating into open rebellions. In June, the famous revolution of 1905 began. The uprising on the battleship, quote, workers' strikes, peasant revolts. All these events were directly linked to the defeats in Manchuria. Kuropatkin, once one of the most respected men of the empire, became a symbol of national humiliation. In August 1905, a peace treaty with Japan was signed in Portsmouth. Russia recognized Korea as a sphere of Japanese influence, ceded southern Sakhalin and the rights to lease the Liaodong Peninsula with Port Arthur. The empire lost not only territories and prestige, but also the people's faith in the competence of the authorities. Nicholas II, realizing the scale of the catastrophe, was forced to make unprecedented concessions. On October 17th, he signed a manifesto granting civil liberties and establishing the State Duma. The monarchy, which seemed unshakable, was seriously shaken for the first time, and at the origin of this process stood a general whose indecisiveness and adherence to the doctrine of retreat turned into a national tragedy. Kuropatkin's strategic miscalculations drew sharp criticism already during the war, but his decisions were analyzed particularly intensely by military theorists of subsequent decades. The central question of this analysis: were there alternative strategies capable of changing the outcome of the conflict? Most experts agree that such opportunities were missed at several key stages of the campaign. The most obvious alternative to the strategy of retreat was active defense with elements of counter-offensive. General Mikhail Dragomirov, an outstanding military theorist of that time, pointed out, quote, particularly sharp criticism was leveled at Kuropatkin's decision to abandon the Liaoyang, quote, end quote, positions in August 1904. General Alexei Ignatiev wrote in his memoirs, "At that moment, the Japanese were at their limit. Their attacks were running out of steam, supplies were experiencing difficulties. A decisive counterattack by the Russian army could not only have repelled the enemy, but also completely changed the psychological atmosphere of the war. Another missed opportunity was the use of Cossack cavalry for raids on Japanese communications. General Pavel Rennenkampf, who commanded a cavalry detachment, repeatedly proposed such operations, but Kuropatkin invariably rejected these proposals, fearing to disperse forces. German military theorist Hans von Seeckt, who studied the Russo-Japanese War, noted, "The Russian army possessed excellent cavalry, capable of operating over vast expanses of Manchuria. Systematic raids on Japanese rear areas could seriously disrupt enemy supplies and force them to divert significant forces to protect communications." A fatal mistake was also the disregard for the specifics of the local theater of military operations. British military attaché Colonel Ian Hamilton, who observed the campaign, wrote, "The Russians acted in Manchuria according to European patterns, without taking into account the specifics of the terrain and climate. The Japanese, however, perfectly adapted their tactics to the conditions of the region." Perhaps the most radical alternative was the strategy proposed by Admiral Evgeny Alexeyev to concentrate the main efforts on the relief of Port Arthur. If the Russian army had broken through to the besieged fortress in the first months of the war, it would not only have preserved the most important naval base, but also put the Japanese in an extremely disadvantageous strategic position, pointed out French military historian Ferdinand Foch in his analysis. It is particularly bitter irony that many alternative strategies were described by Kuropatkin himself in his pre-war theoretical works. He perfectly understood the principles of concentration of forces, choosing the moment for a decisive strike, the importance of troop morale. But he could not apply this knowledge in practice when he found himself burdened with responsibility for the fate of the army and the prestige of the empire. After the crushing defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, Kuropatkin's career seemed over. Removed from command, stripped of influence and respect, he spent several years in obscurity, working on a multi-volume justification of his actions in Manchuria. However, history offered him another chance. With the outbreak of the First World War, experienced generals were in demand, even those whose reputations had been tarnished by past failures. In October 1915, 57-year-old Kuropatkin was appointed commander of the Northern Front, a significant but still limited position compared to his former role as commander-in-chief of all land and naval forces in the Far East. Upon receiving his new appointment, Kuropatkin told his intimates, quote, "It seemed the bitter experience of Manchuria had taught him something. In the first months in his new position, he indeed displayed an uncharacteristic decisiveness. Subordinates noted that the general hesitated less when making decisions and trusted the initiative of junior commanders more." In the spring of 1916, Kuropatkin planned an offensive operation near Lake Naroch, an ambitious attempt to break through the German front and aid Allied France, bleeding under Verdun. However, the result was depressingly familiar. Poor coordination between armies, insufficient artillery preparation, and unfavorable weather conditions led to the failure of the offensive and heavy losses. History repeated itself with frightening accuracy. Despite this setback, in March 1916, the Emperor appointed Kuropatkin commander-in-chief of the armies of the Northern Front. This was the last promotion in his career. The February Revolution of 1917 found Kuropatkin still in command. Like many high-ranking officers, he accepted Nicholas II's abdication as a fait accompli and swore allegiance to the provisional government. However, the new government did not trust Tsarist generals. In July 1917, Kuropatkin was finally removed from command and retired. After the October Revolution, the fate of the former commander-in-chief took an unexpected turn. Instead of emigrating, which many of his colleagues chose, he went to his estate Sheshurino in Pskov Governorate, where he founded a rural school and became a simple geography teacher there. The peasant children he taught had no idea that their modest, gray-bearded teacher once commanded armies and decided the fate of an empire. The name of Alexei Kuropatkin has become, for Russian military history, a symbol of the contradiction between theory and practice. A man whose strategic works were studied in military academies worldwide, on the battlefield he demonstrated fatal indecisiveness that turned the strategy of retreat into a synonym for military failure. Today, more than a century after the Russo-Japanese War, Kuropatkin's figure remains a subject of deep historical discussions and reflections on the nature of military leadership. Kuropatkin's paradox, a brilliant theoretician and an unlucky practitioner, contains important lessons for modern military strategists. First and foremost, his story demonstrates the danger of a disconnect between theoretical knowledge and the psychological readiness to apply it in critical situations. Kuropatkin perfectly understood the principles of military art, but found himself paralyzed by the burden of responsibility when it came time to act. This psychological aspect of command remains relevant even in the era of modern technologies and doctrines. Kuropatkin's legacy as a strategist of retreat deeply influenced the development of Russian military thought. After the Russo-Japanese War, a re-evaluation of the principles of warfare began in the Russian army. Emphasis was placed on the initiative of junior commanders, decisiveness at key moments of battle, and the psychological training of officers. In fact, Kuropatkin's failures became a catalyst for military reforms, which, unfortunately, were not completed before the start of World War I. Interestingly, some elements of Kuropatkin's strategy were later reinterpreted and integrated into Soviet military doctrine. His idea of preserving the army through strategic retreat was reflected in the concept of quote, "one" and quote, "two", applied in the initial period of the Great Patriotic War. The difference was that the Soviet command viewed retreat not as an end in itself, but as a temporary measure for a subsequent counteroffensive. International military thought also learned lessons from Kuropatkin's experience. The Japanese victory demonstrated to the world the importance of troop morale, the advantages of an offensive strategy, and the necessity of adapting tactics to a specific theater of operations. These lessons were taken into account by military theorists of all great powers and influenced preparations for World War I. Kuropatkin's figure remains a reminder that military art is not only a science, but also the art of making decisions in conditions of uncertainty and stress. His life path, from a brilliant theoretician to a rural teacher, represents a tragic but instructive story of how the personal qualities of a military leader can influence the fate of an entire nation.